and welcome to Unblocked Live. I'm Jeremy Lee Quinn. I am the host. My guest today is Shannon Lanier, and this is Unblocked Live. Welcome to Unblocked Live, Shannon. How you doing?
Hey, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And Shannon Lanier is a broadcast journalist who I worked with back in the day at News 12 in Brooklyn. He joins us as the guest today on Unblocked Live. He is a descendant of Thomas Jefferson. And we're going to talk about the Jeffersonian legacy and how you fit into that. And you've been vocal, especially about rethinking and having dialogue about history as we look back. Just out of curiosity, is this something that you always knew about your family heritage, or was it something that you learned as a child? How did you first find out that you were a descendant of Thomas Jefferson?
Yeah, I pretty much knew my entire life. My mother, Priscilla Lanier, passed the oral history down to my brother, Sean, and I. But I was very blessed to have so many people in my family to help captivate the story and really share it to us. They did a lot of the research, like Patty Jo, her mom, Ann Medley, Toddy Redmond, so many people, Uncle Jack, it really did a lot.
I think we
There
still there?
we go. Are you there?
Did we cut out? Is that I got you frozen on
Everybody,
my end.
stay with us.
Yeah. Technical difficulties. Is that am I frozen on your end, or are you frozen? Is it you frozen on mine? Let's see. I seem to have lost Shannon. We'll try it again. Pop back on. But hey, folks, if you're just joining us, my guest today is Shannon Lanier. He is a descendant of Thomas Jefferson. We're going to talk about the Thomas Jefferson, the Jeffersonian legacy, and how history is looked at and taught presently. But I seem to have lost him for the moment, so we're just going to hang out for a second. Feel free to ask any questions. But he may be rebooting. Thanks for the feedback there. As it goes with these things, sometimes you're an internet lost connection away from a little bit of a blackout. So we'll try to find Shannon again and see if we can reconnect. But just so you folks know, Shannon is a broadcast journalist, and from my broadcast journalism days, which is back in, when would that would have been the 2000s in New York City. He and I were both reporters for a new venture that was called News 12 Brooklyn, and it was launched by Cablevision, which at the time owned the New York Knicks. Just a little tidbit fact, usually when you work for one of these media companies, they have multiple properties and multiple outlets and so forth. So Shannon and I worked together as on-the-ground reporters back in the day. We already have a question coming in, so we'll be able to see if hopefully this works out. We've got Shannon back. Shannon.
There we go.
You're there. All right.
I'll tell you, sometimes technology does not agree with us, but we are back and we are live.
We are back. We are live, and we already have a question in the queue. But but first of all, tell us how you came about learning the oral history of your lineage, and how you came to be so vocal also about looking at the Jeffersonian legacy and revisiting it.
All right. I don't know how much was cut off earlier, so I'll say it again. My mother, Priscilla Lanier, passed the oral history down to my brother Sean and I ever since we were babies. I've known ever since I was a kid that I was the 9th generation descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. But a lot of the family members in my family did a lot of research to make that understood and known to us. Like I mentioned earlier, Patty Jo Harding, her mom Ann, my cousin Toddy Redmond, Uncle Jack, really people that made sure they kept the story alive, researched it, went to the tombstones, the graveyards to find out more information, because I guess we always knew we were related to Thomas Jefferson, but maybe not how, and knew all the links and nuances of who begot who. So they did a lot of that research to make it known. So by the time I was born, I had that history, I knew, and now my children know who they're related to. As far as me getting vocal, I guess that started with my Uncle Billy, who is no longer with us, unfortunately, but he made sure I attended the first reunion between the Jefferson side of the family and the Hemmings side of the family. Now, technically, we're all Jeffersons, but to help clarify who's who, we say descendants of Martha Jefferson, who was Jefferson's wife, and descendants of Sally Hemings, who was his slave. And so I am through the Madison side, which was Thomas and Sally's second to last kid. So basically, my Uncle Billy invited me and said, "You got to be at this reunion." I said, "Okay, let's do it." And I went, and because he said I had to. And then I met, while at the reunion, Jane Feldman, who's a photojournalist in New York City, and she's worked her entire life, making sure she fought for civil rights, for equality. And when she heard about this family, she said, "I need to be there to take a picture symbolically for the world of Jefferson and Hemings family coming together at Monticello for the first time since slavery." And so when she was there and she told me about this picture, I was like, "I'll help you. Let's do it." And so I helped her get that now historic photo of, Jefferson and Hemings family members standing on the steps of Monticello, which was seen around the world after that big reunion with everyone there. And then Jane called some contacts she had from working at Random House from her previous books. And she said, "How would you like to go on a tour around the world to meet your family and to do a book for Random House?" I was like, "Sure, let's do it." So I was 19 at the time. I didn't know much about anything, but she really took me under her wing and, helped me learn the ropes and, did a lot of work co-authoring the book with me and also taking photos of it. And so I guess I was kind of thrust into the spotlight through, her guidance, her leadership, and through the family's support of being one of the spokespeople for the family to, be vocal about this. And I guess it was like one of those things I was reluctant to do at first, and sometimes fought it, like, "I don't want to be the spokesperson. I don't want to be the face of this." But, it's one of those things that you keep getting called to do it. You got to step up to the plate.
And tell me a little bit about that reunion. So you said it was back when you were 19. So that that first reunion, what was the atmosphere like? What were the conversations like? How did the one side of the family relate to and learn about the other side?
Well, unfortunately, at the time, it was very divisive because the press wanted to make it into a black-white Jerry Springer show, the black side versus the white side, when really this family is so mixed up and diverse. You can't really say black side versus the white side because some of the black side look like they belong on the white side, and some of the white side looks like they belong on the black side. So it's so mixed up. You can just look at these faces, and when you look at the book, here's one of the books behind me, Jefferson's Children, the story of One American Family. That's the one that Jane and I co-authored together. You can look at some of these photos and say, yeah, these people are definitely related. But at that first reunion, a lot of people were just trying to take it all in, stepping back. I mean, this was in, now 1999 we're talking about, and people were just like, they weren't sure. A lot of people's foundation was just rocked, finding out that, Jefferson had this family and now they're here to visit. And now, some people even on the Hemings side were just finding out that they were related and how they were related. So it was eye-opening for a lot of people. It was an awakening for other people. And it was the truth coming out for a lot of people, because for so many years on the Jefferson side, they were told, "Oh, no, Jefferson didn't do that." Some people were told that. And some of the other Jeffersons were told, "Yeah, totally, it happened." So it just depended on what side of the family and what stories you were raised with that you were told. Like Lucian K. Truscott IV, who was the one who invited the Hemings family to Monticello, he had known it. He knew it to be true his whole life. His parents were very open and honest to him. And others were like, "Oh, no, we were raised knowing that story not to be true. And it was the Carr cousins." But the DNA emphatically proved that it was 100% not the Carr cousins and 99.99999% Jefferson. So some people still say, "But it wasn't 100. It was 99.99." I was like, but it's all the information, the DNA, the historical documentation, the oral history, the doctors and lawyers and scientists that studied this family that proved Jefferson was the father of Sally Hemings' children.
Well, and so what's the state now? You're describing painting a picture of what that was like back at 20 years ago. What is the state of relations between the two sides of that family today, and what kind of conversations take place in regards to the Jeffersonian legacy?
It's been a whole 180 turn. I mean, it's so refreshing to be able to have this diverse family and to be accepted as family. So many people have turned around their attitudes, their behaviors, their acceptance of this family. We go to each other's funerals and weddings and parties and bar mitzvahs or whatever. We hang out and know each other as family. Now, you can't always select your family members, but so you take the good with the bad in some situations. So I think for the most part, it's the story that the press doesn't always like to talk about, that this family has come together despite the odds, despite being separated from slavery and being able to accept each other, and know each other as family and have forgiveness and reconciliation and all those things in this family. We're family, and we had to go through that healing process for a lot of us. And for some people, like, again, I say an awakening, because they were learning through this process and they were getting a better understanding. When you look at all the documentation, how can you deny it? You know what I mean? And so for some of those people, they really didn't want to look at it at first. But once they started to look at it, once they started to hear the stories and do some of the research, you're like, yeah, okay, I see it. I believe it now.
Interesting. And can you tell me a little bit about like what's something that you think people should know more about Thomas Jefferson and about his legacy that they might not know from school, or something that you are able to offer that people are surprised by?
Well, I think Jefferson did many great things for this country, but he was also a hypocrite. He was also very contradictory to some of the things he said and did. He owned more than 600 slaves. And I think people don't realize that, this is a man, yes, he was a founding father who talked about, equal and, rights for all, but yet he was not doing that at his own home at Monticello. He had at least 7 children with Sally Hemings, and a lot of people don't even know that. So I think that's important that people know more about this true person who was the founding father, not just the good stuff that he did, but also the stuff that wasn't good, like being a slave owner, like having children with one of his slaves. And a lot of people will say, but they were in love. But can a slave really be in love with their captor? Maybe it's Stockholm syndrome. I don't know. But at some point, people have to realize that regardless of what she felt and what she did, she was property, and he could do what he wanted when he wanted to her. Maybe it's easier to see it as a love relationship instead of, my great, 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 great grandmother being raped for 38 years. So a lot of people, it's easier to stomach by seeing it that way, because they, how dare they think of their iconic president, Thomas Jefferson, being a rapist. But, I guess whatever it takes for you to stomach it is what some people have to deal with in their own consciousness. But another thing that people don't realize is that Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson's wife, Martha, were half sisters, because they had the same father who was also a slave owner. You get that?
Yeah, this is the first. I mean, I asked the question. I said, "What's something I might not know?" And so I'm trying to, I guess, put this all together because, I of course have that idyllic version of Thomas Jefferson from my childhood. I remember the first time when I was 8 years old, or 9 years old, I went to the Jefferson Memorial, and I went to Washington, D.C. for the first time and learned about the founding fathers and so forth. And tell me a little bit about this last year, because the media seized upon, and I know that you gave interviews, the idea of revisiting our founding fathers and their legacies and putting them in more context when it comes to these monuments in Washington, D.C. Now, this was before people started tearing down monuments. And I want to sort of make a distinction between what your point of view might be as far as having to look at history and how it should be taught and recontextualized, and the difference between that and then people just tearing down statues. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't believe that people should go around just destroying things. I don't condone that. However, when people are tired of being ignored and they're tired of speaking out and no justice being done and no one's listening to them, they have to be drastic and act dramatically. And that's what we saw happening. I believe that these statues should be taken down respectfully and put into a place of learning, like an institution where people can learn more about them and the whole person, not just say this is a great person, who did great things, but talk about the complexity of who this person is and what they did in context to history and add some conceptualization to it. Because a lot of times we have these statues and we have a name and it's we're idolizing them, but we don't even know why. We don't know who they are and what they did and what the links they may have had to the Confederacy. Why are we celebrating these people? And why are they on this pedestal looking down on people that are tax-paying people like everybody else? They should not have to be belittled by this statue. Or, when some of these statues were put up, they were to put people in their place as a reminder. This person was over you. This person was condemning you. This person was doing this. And people should not have to be looked down upon as equal citizens in this country. And so those statues should be removed. They should be taken down. They should be put in places.
Are we making a distinction between the founding fathers and Civil War generals? Which one do you make a distinction between the two, or are you talking about both?
I think if they are not talked about, if they are not mentioned, and for example, people will say the Jefferson Memorial. Well, I think it should be more comprehensive of who he was as a person. They still have time to get it right. For example, when you go to Monticello, where he lived, and you go to UVA, they talk more there about the totality of who he was, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think we should use that as a learning opportunity to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of what this person was and what they did and who they are, and not just hail them as a great founding father and things like that. I think you tell everything and use it as a learning tool, but it should be also placed in places of education and learning opportunity for people like the museums, like historical monuments, where people can learn about this person and teach our history the correct way. So many times we are taught history from one side. We're not taught the entire history. We're taught by, his story, and we're usually by older white men and not diverse people, not a diverse group of people, not people with varying opinions that can sit together in a committee and make sure we include everything about this person. If you are going to go through the trouble of making a monument for this person, go through the trouble of educating people about the whole person. So that's what I think could be done. That's what I think Monticello is doing well with what they're doing and preserving history. At now erecting the old slave cabins, telling the slave stories, telling it who really built it. You went to Monticello 30 years ago, 40 years ago, they act like Jefferson built it himself. I was like, he wasn't out there building nothing. Like, that was us. That was our ancestors that were out there building it. And now they're telling that full story of how it was the slaves who were pretty brilliant to be able to make these bricks and these nails and to construct these architectural diagrams that Jefferson drew for them to be able to conceptualize it and create and make things better that he wanted for his home.
Well, certainly I see the difference in what you're describing between how Monticello seems to be telling a more comprehensive, holistic, representation of who Jefferson was. But as far as the Jefferson Memorial, and a memorial like that, which, has pomp and circumstance, and it has a statue of him, right? A big towering statue, much like, and I remember when I was a child going to all the different, sort of corners of the mall and going to the Lincoln Memorial, going to the Jefferson Memorial. Is there a place for sort of that just pomp and circumstance, I guess you could call it, that this is the fast food version of Thomas Jefferson, that there can be a statue there? Or do you feel that there is still condescension in just that statue being there at the Jefferson Memorial and the lack of context for the bigger picture?
Yeah, I think that lack of context is the problem, and especially because that monument is sort of hailed as a symbol of freedom and equality when he was anything but. You're saying that this is a symbol of freedom and equality, but yet even an abolitionist back in Jefferson's time who was trying to get him on the bandwagon to help fight slavery and be an abolitionist, they said, here lies, here is a man who, I think the quote was something like, I've never before have I seen a person get so much credit for something they did not do, because he talked about equality, but he did not do it. And so from the mouth of abolitionists, stop giving him credit for something that he did not do. And he could have done more. In the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, he mentioned that slaves should be free. And although it did not end up in the last version of the Declaration of Independence, he didn't do anything to help it. He did not say, okay, well, if you don't want it in there, I'm still going to free my slaves. Let me set an example. Let me free mine. Let me make my slaves indentured service. He had plenty of room on that mountaintop to say, let me put you out of work. You'll earn a wage and you can still, or keep your crops or something. There were so many alternatives that he could have done and set an example as a quote unquote leader, that he could have done more to lead in this situation.
And I think with expanding territories as well, during his lifetime, he was in a position to have done more. And I remember reading about that. I see you have Hamilton, the book,
Hamilton over here.
Hamilton over there on that side. Yeah, there you go.
And then this is the first edition of Jefferson's Children, and then you have there's the other one over here. There. That's right there. That's the second edition of Jefferson's Children, the paperback with all the family faces on the front that Jane and I did.
Right. Now, I mentioned the Hamilton Broadway play because, of course, Jefferson is portrayed as somewhat of a hypocrite and a fop and a foil in that production. Interestingly enough, so which kind of in a humorous, dramatic way portrays little of the contradictions and the as you describe it, hypocrisy. Now, I just want to sort of where from here, like how do you envision, or what would you like people to know about how we look back? And it got a little muddled there when we were talking about Confederate generals, because I know that there are some statues that were built during the civil rights era, during the 20th century, to sort of prop up a kind of, cultural establishment with Civil War generals. And so I think that is a very different conversation, and especially in the South, and whether certain cities are historically landmarked as part of history and so forth, with battles and so on. But that and the Founding Fathers, and certainly the Jefferson Memorial itself, it seems like we can't use just broad strokes. These are all different conversations to be had about context from my point of view. Do you see it that way? Or do you think when it comes to statues of, whether it's generals or Founding Fathers that own slaves, that it all needs to be looked at again?
I think it all needs to be looked at again and clarified. And I think, the Confederates, I think they should all go. They put them in museums or somewhere, because they weren't even fighting for the betterment of this country. You know what I mean? The Founding Fathers are a little bit more complex because of the things that they were doing to found this country. So if that's something that they want to recognize, then they also need to tell the full story of these people and let the people looking at it decide how they feel about this person. Don't make it slanted. Don't make it one-sided. Tell the full story of these people. We're smart enough to look at this, to read the knowledge and the information, and be able to decide for ourselves. It's time we start teaching history the way it's supposed to be taught, where you let all the information be known and then let people decide how they feel about it. Like Christopher Columbus, I don't know why we're still celebrating Columbus Day. It's like, are we just lying to people? Like, why are we celebrating? We know the truth. Let's tell the truth. And that's what a lot of times is not being done.
It's interesting how history becomes litigated in a way. And we do have a responsibility to tell the full story. My mom was born in a Japanese American They were effectively concentration camps. Now we say
Mhm.
relocation camp or internment camp in Wyoming during World War II. So that's a part of history that's not taught. I know when I went to the East Coast for the first time, even though it's taught in California, because that's where a majority of the Japanese Americans were interned from. Once I went to the East Coast or traveled, there was colleagues of mine who did not know about that chapter of American history, and so I think that there is a responsibility, as you said, to tell all of these different stories. Now, when you come to Columbus, it's interesting because he is such a figure of Italian heritage, but now even in the just last 10 years, we're getting new information and new historical context for Columbus. But I
I don't know
think,
why people are so afraid to correct history. They're like, oh, we can't change history. We can't be revisionist. No, you're just telling the full story. You're just updating. Now we know more. Now we have a better understanding. So just tell the truth. And they feel like it's a revisionist agenda, or like, no, we're just telling the truth.
well, what you grow up with, solidifies. I remember thinking of Columbus from my childhood as, and certainly if I were Italian American, that would have been taught, and culturally, that would have been something that you would um, relate to, I guess, as part of heritage. So it's confusing in the sense that we're taking modern lenses and we're applying the modern lens of what is right and wrong to stuff that played out in, the 16th century or during the Revolutionary War era. So the question becomes, do you then place a judgment on it, or as you said, do you just give all the information and let people make their own decisions?
I think it's about starting that dialogue and getting the conversation going, because people are going to judge regardless of what you do, and they're going to judge in contemporary eyes opposed to historical eyes. So, for example, a lot of people will say, well, Sally Hemings was a teenager when Jefferson started her relationship with him, so he was a child molester. Well, there was no term child molester back then. So, in their eyes, she was a grown woman. People died earlier in life, so they started relationships and started having children earlier in life. So in that aspect, in those days there was nothing wrong with that. These days people see a problem with that. So I think you have to have that conversation and say, well, this is why it was sort of different then, and this is how lives were lived then. And then that's opens up a whole nother discussion of educating people about what life was like in the 18th century. So it's, I just think you put it out there and you start that conversation, you may be able to educate people on several levels, opposed to just thinking it's just teaching them one thing.
Now, what do you say to the doubters? I see that there is
Mhm.
a comment of somebody who's questioning what the full story is and the evidence that shows the parentage of Sally Hemings' children. I mean, it's something that I imagine is there resistance, and how do you talk to people who ask that if the DNA tests prove that Thomas Jefferson was the father, or that they prove that he asks if the grandfather was the ancestor. And I'm not familiar with this line of questioning, but
Mhm.
perhaps you are, and maybe can address
So
that.
what they're saying is that they didn't exhume Jefferson because they're not going to. They're not going. So
Mhm.
they were able to take the DNA for Jefferson's side of the family from Field Jefferson, and it is believed that Thomas Jefferson and this person had the same DNA, had the same markers. There was this like unique marker that was in the Jefferson male line that pointed to Jefferson, but that person was never there when Sally Hemings conceived. So again, earlier I said it was all the documentation that pointed at Jefferson being the father, that he was the only Jefferson there every time she conceived, that it was the DNA along with the oral history of the story and all the documentation in his own books. And the fact that he freed Sally Hemings' children. The oral history said that Sally Hemings agreed to come back from Paris with Jefferson because he promised her that he would free all of the children they have together at the age of 21. The only slaves that Jefferson ever freed at the age of 21 was Sally Hemings' children, so which matched the oral history and the written history with what was said. And so it was all that documentation that led to the belief that Thomas Jefferson was the father of the children. Now, another thing was these children were not just freed. They were given trades, they were taught, they were given money, and they were seen to freedom safely on a stagecoach with an overseer to make sure they were able to leave safely. In his farm books, he said they ran away. That's a very comfortable way to run away. Now we're only doing a small conversation here, so I can't go on for 20 hours about, proving the paternity of these children. I don't need validation from anyone or to prove anything to anyone, but there's plenty of documentation out there. If people want to study it more, you can go to Monticello. You can look up several books where from Annette Gordon Reed to, Jefferson's Children, one of my book with Jane that we did, and several other documentations from historical figures that are much more educated and qualified to talk to it. They have doctors out the woozah that could talk about this for years about proving his paternity. So it is complicated. In the book, we have the DNA test to show you specifically how the DNA was taken and how it had to go from a sequential Y chromosome through male line of the family. That points out to the study that Dr. Eugene Foster did to prove the DNA, as well as oral historians and Annette Gordon Reed and Beverly Gray, who contributed to the book for the more historical aspects. I'm not a historian. I'm not a scientist. So we went to those experts in the book to get their perspective and get their documentation of how it was proven that Jefferson was the father.
Okay, and again, you mentioned Monticello, which I don't, I haven't been to, and I'd be interested to go after, especially after this conversation. And it is taught. How do they frame it at Monticello? I know you do have to go, so I just want to ask this as sort of a last question: is how is it taught at Monticello? What can be learned from that, and what positives do you see, and what would you like to see?
Yeah, well, now it is taught that Thomas Jefferson is the father of Sally Hemings' children at Monticello. When you go there today, you can ask the tour guides, who are not necessarily scripted, but they are, give the information as they interpret it. I was just there last week. I'm going again in a few weeks. And that's what they say. They say that he was the father of their children. And they talk about Mulberry Row and where the slaves you worked and lived. They talk about where Sally Hemings' room was, which was just recently discovered there, and what her jobs were and her responsibilities were there at Monticello. So, I think there may always be those naysayers who don't want to believe documentation and history and the truth. Unfortunately, that's on them. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but those are some of the people that may be a little bit more closed-minded and not open to all the documentation and to just what slavery was like. Those people were your property. If you felt like you wanted to, have your way with a slave, then you could. And many slave owners did, and that's just what was done in the times. Jefferson's father-in-law did it. That's how he got his slaves, through his father-in-law. That's also how Sally Hemings and Martha Jefferson were half sisters, because of what Martha Jefferson's father did. So if your mentor and your father-in-law was doing the same thing, where does it get so strange that you would do the same thing? And also, Sally Hemings probably looked like his wife because they were half sisters. His wife died in childbirth after, what's funny is how his wife almost died every time she gave birth, and eventually she did die in childbirth. That's not the funny part. The funny part is where people think Jefferson would just all of a sudden never have sex again. Here is a man whose wife almost died every single time she got pregnant, and yet they kept trying to have children, kept having children, and they thought he was just stop and never have sex again. Well, here comes Sally Hemings, who is beautiful. She's young. She may favor your wife and look like her, and she's around you all the time. Where would it get so hard to believe that he would like someone like that or have an infatuation for someone like that? So unfortunately, it is what it is. Some people will believe what they want to believe. Like I said, I don't need to prove myself or have validation from anyone else. But I think in the bigger picture, going forward, we need to just, use, my co-author Jane Feldman always said, we even though Jefferson did not mean all people are created equal when he wrote those words in the Declaration of Independence, we now can live up to that statement that he made by all living it in our everyday lives. We're just considering people as human beings and considering them as equal regardless of what they look like. People in this country, that we're looking for healing. We need healing. We need peace. We need reconciliation. We need hope. And we can look at those words and still to this day interpret it to mean everyone, every person, not just men, not just white men, not just land owning men, but everyone, women, and everything in between can all be equal. We can all have this equality. And it's up to each and every one of us, as Jane says, to live out those words in everything that we do and everything we say, and to really be the change we want to see in the world. And I think we can get there. It's going to take some time because as current headlines now depict, we got a lot of work to do. We're not there yet. We've come a long way, but we still have a lot of work to do in this country. But I think we can get there eventually.
As do I. As do I. My guest has been Shannon Lanier. Shannon, thanks so much for joining us. Tell people a little bit more about where they can find your work these days. And
yeah. Well, right now I'm a television news anchor down in Houston, H-Town. You can follow me on social media at Mr. Shannon Lanier across all social media platforms. That's Lanier. And you can also check me out as the host of the Daddy Duty 365 podcast, where I interview celebrity dads about the good, the bad, and the funny of fatherhood. That's Daddy Duty 365, where we have a lot of fun. We laugh, we cry, and we talk everything parenting.
All right. Shannon, thanks for coming on, and thanks for being on Unblocked Live. Until next time,